Dr. Richard Munang is the head of Global Environment Monitoring, Early Warning and Assessment Division at United Nations Environment Program, UNEP. So, Dr. Richard, you are welcome to give your speech to our guests and listeners. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, the CEO of Nation Media Group, all Nation Media Fraternity, government officials present here today, all invited guests, distinguished delegates, ladies and gentlemen. It's a great pleasure to be here, and I think the CEO and my good friend Joe articulated and put in perspective the reality of climate change and where we've come from and where we are today. And first of all, I would just like to congratulate the Nation Media Group, not just for creating the space for thought leadership, but also creating the space to encourage ideation, because what makes the difference in crisis, and especially climate crisis, is when we ideate to come up with new solutions, is when we encourage thought leadership. And the Kusi Festival that happened now for the fourth time, and also this Earthwise Summit, is an opportunity to reshape not just the narrative of climate change, but also to prefer opportunities. Because we know, as it is said, that there is no beauty but only the beauty of action. This African proverb analogizes a topic that I've been asked to talk about: the climate policy and governance gap in the African continent, and how we can be able to fix it. This proverb that there is no beauty but only the beauty of action is timely and is very, very important. It analogizes climate governance landscape across the entire African continent as we speak today. The continent of Africa has not actually kept pace when it comes to tangible, impactful actions that move the needle forward. From being a global leader, which is an aspect that sometimes I always argue this, that Africa is a global leader when it comes to climate policy. And sometimes if we do not appreciate progress, we cannot be able to make progress. I've been a global leader in ratifying the Paris Climate Change Agreement, to improving institutional structures and enhancing environmental litigation actions. Africa's headline: progress in climate policy and governance is beyond reproach, and nobody can be able to argue with that. 52 African countries out of 54 ratified the Paris Climate Change Agreement, bringing 98% of the countries during the first round of the nationally determined contributions, which are simple climate action plans that African countries have put in place to implement. With the submission of the updated climate action plans, formerly called the nationally determined contribution, Africa once again led the way more than any other part of the world, becoming a leader. And on this leaders' board, 45 countries have submitted the updated climate plans, more than any other part of the world, with the highest ambition. Kenya, where we're speaking from today, led the way, submitting one of the most ambitious plans in the entire world to reduce emissions by 32% in the next 7 years from today. And that needs to be applauded. Beyond these climate action plans, we have 15 African countries that have submitted what we call the national adaptation plans to complement these NDCs. The African Union climate strategy is in place. That was launched just 2 years ago. At a regional level, the regional economic communities have actually put in place climate frameworks, policies, like the East African Climate Change Policy Framework for East Africa region. At a national level, we are seeing so many countries that are coming up with climate laws. Kenya in 2016 came up with an ambitious climate act that did not only pave the way for the continent, but saw even developed countries copying to do the same thing, to set in place such a law. To West Africa, where we have Senegal having 19 different climate laws, to Zambia, and to many African countries, what we are seeing is that Africa is actually taking center stage. And when it goes to each and every African country, as we're speaking today, environmental protection agencies, over 20 environmental protection agencies are actively engaged in what we call environmental governance in their respective countries. Africa is also active on climate justice more than any other part of the world, and this deserves to be mentioned. With the doubling of climate litigation in the continent, it shows that Africa is not just standing in one place, but is making progress when it comes to climate governance and policy. Kenya is a splendid example. As I've mentioned, when it comes to policy and institutional leadership, the country has up to 19 policies and laws aligned to combat climate change, starting at the very top, which we need to applaud. Aligned with the Constitution, which recognizes the right to a healthy and sustainable environment as an essential human right. In Article 32, Paragraph 1 of your Constitution, it guarantees the right to a clean and healthy environment. To the legislation, which I've already mentioned in your 2016 Act. In addition, the Kenyan National Environment Management Authority stands as among the best in the continent when it comes to be engaging in active institutional playing field when it comes to climate change. But with all these policies and institutional set up in place, one thing is missing. And that one thing that is missing is very, very fundamental, because the question will be, if Africa have all this, why are we still seeing our mothers and brothers and sisters buried under floods? Our mothers and brothers and sisters with drought, not only plunging them into suffering, but at the same time making them miserable and looking for places in which they can be able to find sanctuaries. This is a big question, because the policies that have been in place, even though this policy excellence is there, it has not translated to the scale of investments that are needed to be able to climate-proof Africa's development. For example, Africa is the world's region most affected by droughts and floods, as I mentioned. Since 2010, the continent has been one of the most affected regions by drought and floods. Yet only about 40% of African countries are covered by early warning systems. To enable preparedness against these most prevalent climatological risks, and even among those with coverage, the quality of the information is not always optimal. With over 70%, as we're speaking today, of the continent, national determined NDCs, national determined contributions called the NDCs, have prioritized two fundamental sectors, what are called Africa's comparative sectors. The agricultural sector and the clean energy sector constitute 70% in each African country's NDC. And these critical sectors are to build climate resilience, but yet only 2.1% of the continent's public budget are invested in sustainable agriculture. And only 8 countries made the 6% agricultural value added growth target that was agreed by the African Union. At the same time, we are in a continent today that receives almost 365 days of sunshine. But yet, with the best solar resources in the planet, the continent accounts for less than 1%, as we're speaking today, of the global solar installed capacity. And from an investment lens, it becomes even more troubling, where Africa currently attracts less than 1.5% of global renewable energy investments as we're speaking today. Yet the global renewable energy market is on the rise. It's on the rise on a growth trajectory that is expected to reach a value of $2 trillion in 7 years from today. But the continent is not attracting that much. And with all these distinguished colleagues, ladies and gentlemen, it becomes quite very, very imperative to ask the question, why is it that the continent, despite the fact that it's got all this, is not making enough progress? And the answer comes down to one thing. It comes down to the fact that there is a stressor that the continent needs. Because even when it comes to finance, the continent is struggling. Just 2 weeks ago, the United Nations Environment Programme released its 2018 2023 adaptation gap report, which underscored that the adaptation gap is increasing, and the gap is such that the world, especially developing countries, which most of them are in the African continent, need 10 to 18 times as much finance to be able to drive adaptation. And that public financing has not been enough. And that the current adaptation gap is now estimated between 194 billion to 366 billion per year. On Monday next week, the emissions gap report of the United Nations Environment Programme will be released. And the statistics are scary. The statistics are scary because records are getting broken when it comes to temperature rise. And the report will reveal that the current Paris Agreement pledges are insufficient, setting the world on a path to up to 2.9 degrees. And that is going to be dangerous, and I'd like to focus and say something about this because Africa, as we speak today, warming twice as fast as the rest of the world, and if global temperatures are to reach 1.5 degrees, which is the temperature in which the Paris Agreement is actually to ensure that the world doesn't surpass, but where we are heading today, the world is heading towards a 2.9 degrees. But Africa warming twice as fast as the rest of the world is not also uniformly distributed. Right here in Kenya, places like Turkana are warming already above 1.5. That it means that if the world was to reach 1.5, we will see so many places not only becoming inhabitable, but will plunge millions of people into suffering. And this reality tells us, distinguished colleagues, ladies and gentlemen, that one of the most overlooked facts when it comes to climate debate in this continent is that one of the important stressors is always left out. And this we have to address today. The most overlooked fact about climate change is that its solutions will not only come from the climate space. Its solutions act in a self-reinforcing paradigm as part of action to address what is fondly today known as the triple planetary crisis. In addition to the climate change crisis, we have nature and biodiversity loss crisis. We have pollution and waste, and we cannot be able to discuss solutions to climate change without looking at these cascading aspects, which are quite very, very important. A practical example that is simple for each and every one of us to understand is protecting nature. And restoring some of what has been lost could account for at least 30% of all global actions that are needed to be able to address climate change. But as we're speaking today across the continent, the statistics are visible. 3% of global climate investments goes towards nature solutions, and at the same time, air pollution from sources, as methane, that are up to 80 times more potent in causing climate change, investments are still minimal. This means that climate solutions need to be complemented by nature and pollution action. If we ignore that, as the silos have been in the continent, we might be doing our best, but we might not be going in the direction that is needed. And while 70% of the globe, as I indicated earlier, is actually covered by monitoring and early warning systems that cover against climatological risk, early warning services against nature and pollution risk as we speak today that reinforce climate risk are largely unavailable as we speak in the continent. This therefore calls for one word: reimagination. We need a serious reimagination because the realities and the facts have been established. They've been established and the science is unequivocally clear that the climate is changing. Yes, it's unequivocally clear that Africa is a leader when it comes to climate policy. It's unequivocally clear that the gaps when it comes to finance, to put investment in place, all these we know. But what we've been doing needs to be reshaped, and that needs a reimagination of solutions. And that reimagination is important because this call for a reimagination in our approach to drive transformational climate action needs to happen like yesterday. From our time and from our take on the climate narrative, from looking at it from a different perspective, because we've been projecting risk for quite a very long time. And that climate narrative of risk needs to change. It needs to change because we cannot be able to talk about what is important without also talking about the socioeconomics, despite the fact that the science is unequivocally clear. It needs to change, And this change is important for each and every one of us. And the first aspect to reimagine, to ensure that the climate governance in the continent is actually enhanced, and enhanced in a way that is fit for purpose and is inclusive, is we must reimagine Africa's climate narrative. I have never understood this. Traditional radio and media print are the main source of information, and we must be able to applaud the Nation Media Group for not only organizing these meetings, but at the same time bringing a narrative change that is needed in the continent, but more importantly across the entire African continent. What we see is that when climate change is reported, it's reported from the risk perspective. That's okay. And we saw this during this COP that was christened the African COP at COP 27, which was christened the African COP, and one of the biggest news argument or element was the agreement on loss and damage. Yes, it was, and that's okay. However, the argument that underpinned it, and is still underpinning it today, like all other phenomena on climate change, was around liabilities. That's okay. But how African economies have also lost an estimated 290 billion to 490 billion over the years was what underpinned the discussion. That is okay. But what is not okay is that there was no single narrative of solutions and opportunities that can be actually unleashed as a result of addressing the changing climate. And therefore the focus of discussion around climate change on the liability aspect needs to change to focus on opportunity, because climate change is an investment opportunity. Climate action is an investment opportunity. It is a socio-economic transformation that unless we start to reshape this narrative, we will always be overwhelmed with the risk. And yet, risk versus risk do not take and move the needle forward. Whereas solutions seen through investment will attract investors to be able to invest in clean energy, in transformational solutions that can be able to put food on the table and more money in more pockets. That change in narrative is very, very important. And today, this discussion needs to be reshaped, because if you look at the climate opportunities, most of the time the discussion is not really taking the shape in which it's supposed to take. It is estimated that every $1 that is invested in adaptation action unlocks a return of up to about $10. And more importantly, this comes from food systems, it comes from infrastructure and water. And in addition, every $1 that is invested in nature-based action that our mothers are actually practicing, conservation agriculture, agroforestry, can actually be able to return a 30-fold return. In Africa and other developing countries, an investment of over $800 million on nature-based solutions would result in benefits of up to about 16 billion annually. And yet we're talking in a continent today where most of our mothers, our brothers and sisters in communities depend on chemicalized fertilizer, but turning simple agricultural waste into biofertilizer will not only ensure that at least most of our mothers can be able to have access to have productive harvest, but it will also restore our soils. And this will create jobs for the young people in turning agricultural waste, in turning household organic waste into biofertilizer, which is a compounding opportunity that is rising at 5.9% each and every year. And this will replace not just chemicalized fertilizers that are disrupting our soils and leaching into our rivers and killing aquatic life, but at the same time will tap into opportunities that put poverty on the run and prosperity into the cockpit. Beyond this, the narrative in the continent needs to change. Adaptation alone will not move a needle. And that is why leveraging mitigation actions to power adaptation must become the narrative we need. I have never understood why these synergies are never met. Our mothers in community that use solar power irrigation, that solar power irrigation is a mitigation action, but it helps that mother to irrigate her farm. But it is an investment opportunity, and irrigating that farm means that she can be able to harvest her crops. That mitigation powering adaptation must become the narrative of now. And this is quite very, very important. Simple solar dryers that can be able to help not only reduce post-harvest losses, are opportunities that can actually be tapped. 2 hours from where we are today, to Mwea, where rice is produced in Kenya here. During a downpour, a mother loses up to about 50 kilograms of rice. When I went there, I saw it firsthand. But when we engage young people in the process of retooling their skills and developing simple solar dryers, they save the mothers who are losing rice as a result of downpour, which they used to dry the rice in open air, in open spaces, contaminated by dust, and sometimes even dropping from birds. Today, they are leveraging solar dryers, and they're not just saving them the drying time, but at the same time, the young people producing these solar dryers are putting money in their pockets. Simple climate action solutions will address youth unemployment. Simple climate action solutions will address the problems that our communities are facing today. But sometimes we overlook this, and the communication is always on grander agendas, on big aspects, whereas that mother can be able to leverage a solar dryer. And the same goes for solar cool fridges. So projecting enterprise opportunities is the narrative that Africa needs today. And the United Nations Environment Programme is supporting action to change the climate narrative by structurally working with academic institutions to integrate climate action as a source of climatepreneurship so that it's put within the vision of national development and ensure that teaching these within the curricula of tertiary education becomes the norm and not the exception. And the last aspect in this narrative is when we have the climate plans, that's not enough. If you get into a shop today and you want to buy something, you will look at it whether it's what the value that it's costing. And this applies to everyone, that your money should go to where your mouth should thank you. It is the same when we put in place climate plans, which need to be applauded. Those climate plans need to be turned into investment plans so that investors can see what is in need for me. Is it worth investing in driving solar power irrigation? Is it worth in investing in upscaling solar dryers? Is it worth in investing in turning waste to biofertilizer so that at least we can run away from chemicalized fertilizers? It therefore means we must be able to turn the popular nationally determined contributions into tangible investment plans that elucidate the investment opportunity. And that takes me to a second aspect that we must reimagine. We must reimagine our food systems. The fact that we have climate policies and governance, we are in a continent today that faces what I call the three paradox. The paradox of food insecurity, the paradox of energy poverty, and the paradox of finance gap that we are seeing each and every day. But when it comes to food systems, we must reimagine, because agriculture is at the core of climate commitment in each and every African country. Its reimagination in the context of building climate resilience must be looked at from a different perspective, not only about production. I grew up in the northwestern part of Cameroon, and my mother and my father are smallholder farmers. And what actually reshaped me in growing up was that the small farm that she had was what was feeding the entire family. But when a drought happened, we started sleeping with a stomach aching of hunger. And that was firsthand when I felt that going to school without having eaten food was as painful, and millions across the continent today do face that very scenario and precarious moment. But what we noticed was that there were years she had bumper harvest, but that bumper harvest of maize, of beans, of vegetables will get lost. Why? Because value was not added to it. And it therefore means that the story of our mothers and brothers and sisters in communities across the continent, we cannot be able to build climate resilience when food is not put on the table. And it means we must move from talking only about production to start talking about two words: value addition. Value addition is important, and it's critical because Africa's disproportionate climate vulnerability is because of a low socio-economic base. And I've argued this. We are not going to stop droughts and floods. Yes, we can minimize it, because the emissions in our atmosphere today are such that the world has warmed up to 1.1 degrees as we speak today. And Africa is warming twice as fast as the rest of the world. So even if emissions were curtailed to reach 1.5, Africa will still need to do a lot. But you cannot be able to afford an alternative when there is a drought or flood, when there's no money in your pocket. It means anything that is done must be able to put food on the table and more money in more pockets. That is resilience. That is socio-economic resilience that each and every African needs. And therefore, with that value addition, that cannot happen. And the continent is losing, as we speak today, $48 billion because of post-harvest losses. In 2021, the continent imported food worth $121 billion. Yet, at the same time, we're seeing $48 billion going down the drain because of lack of value addition. Whereas leveraging simple solar dryers, clean energy powered solutions can be able to reverse this. And these are not even capital intensive, as I mentioned. Cool storage to solar dryers. And our informal models and informal food traders in Africa can earn up to 30 times if value is added to what they produced. Right here in Kenya, post-harvest losses cost the country each and every year $662 million worth of opportunities, worth of enterprises, and prioritizing value addition and leveraging on what is accessible to our mothers in communities, to our brothers and sisters, to our fathers in communities will create opportunities because our young people can start developing these solar dryers, developing these cool fridges, developing these opportunities that can be able to be tapped into. And that takes me to the third point. And it's an aspect today I've never understood. The third point is we must reimagine our energy systems. I have never understood the population of Africa today is at a point in which the over 1.4 billion African citizens have over 80% of them in the informal sector. These are our mothers and brothers and sisters and fathers who do not have access to electricity, and 620 million of them are energy impoverished. These, our very mothers and sisters, 920 million of them use unclean cooking. Yes, when the narrative comes to energy access, sometimes we hear grid electricity. I can tell you this as a fact. Grid electricity will not address the informality issue in the continent today. It is off-grid. It is clean electricity, renewable, that can be able to reach there. But beyond just decentralizing renewable energy for people to have access to electricity, the narrative needs to change to prioritize powering income-generating uses, especially agro-value addition. It therefore means we must reimagine our energy system to go beyond just access to electricity, to leverage that electricity, what I call competitive energy, to add value to what is produced in local communities. And this will unlock enterprise opportunities from value addition that will enable communities to afford alternatives. Let's imagine this. A mother in a community, in a country, have access to electricity. Where will she get money to buy the bulb, the light bulb, if she cannot be able to leverage that very electricity to add value, to make money, and be able to afford an alternative? To buy a light bulb, people will need income sources. And this can only come when electricity is leveraged to power opportunities and enterprises. In Kenya, where we are today, up to 90% of the power is clean. And Kenya is not just a country in Africa, but in the entire world that produces, that actually have 90% of the power clean and generated from renewable systems, with up to 75% and even above, including 65% of rural areas and even above being connected to power. This is just, it's not just something for you to be happy about, it's something for all of us Africans to be proud about, because Kenya is setting the trajectory for other countries. That takes me to the fourth point of reimagination, which is a transport system. Africa as a continent today, the global smart transportation market is projected to grow from 94.5 billion to 156.5 billion in just 3 years from today, at a compounding interest rate, growth rate of 10.6%. What this means is that Africa Urbanizing at a very fast rate today means that urban transportation should not only be about to transport people from town to village or from village to town. We should be connecting e-mobility that is emerging, e-vehicles that are emerging to farms so that they can connect what is produced in our farms to markets. And this will provide an opportunity because as the push to beat plastic pollution gathers steam, so opportunities for circularity also take center stage. Making pavement routes from plastic waste will be one opportunity that can be tapped into, and connecting e-mobility, e-vehicles. To be able to leverage this becomes important. But as we do this, we must understand the fifth aspect, which is how to reimagine finance. The UNEP Adaptation Gap report, as indicated, shows the financing gap up to 366 billion each and every year for the entire globe and for developing countries, and most of those developing countries on the African continent. Because to be able to drive the above product lines that I've mentioned, we need to tap financially viable markets. And therefore, we need to reimagine financing from the perspective that if a continent today that have over 80% of the population in the informal sector, and most of them youth, in a continent where over 60% of the population is youthful, and at the same time, 60% of this very youthful population is unemployed, it just behoves each and every one of us. It begs us to reimagine financing on how we can tap into informal institutions, the chamas, the communal cooperatives, the njangis, as they call it, where I come from. Every community in Africa do have a chama. They do have a communal cooperative. They do have a njangi. It is our time to start thinking, how do we leverage these communal cooperatives to make them the norm, not the exception, to invest and channel climate financing money to reach our mamambogas in communities through these accessible structures. That debate must become the center stage if Africa is actually to move the needle forward. Without having that debate and making that become part and parcel of the narrative, we'll be missing not only in terms of climate action, but condemning our brothers and sisters never to have the opportunity. Because in these communities, the language with my youth in this boardroom may not be the language they understand. But the language that speaks to them means if we don't leverage accessible indigenous structures that speaks to the people and tap into what they do and enhance it, we might never ever be able to make progress. And that responsibility rests on each and everyone's shoulder. Because it is very, very important at this point in time for us to understand that the people that we're talking about here today may not even understand the subject matter as we do, but yet they understand the solution more than us because they live it day and night. And that responsibility means we must tap into what they need. That takes me to the sixth point on reimagination, which is we must reimagine a new budgeting approach to make sustainable budgeting the norm and not the exception across the African continent today. What we are seeing is that yes, African countries must be applauded because they are contributing up to 20% of the adaptation needs in the continent. 22 billion of adaptation needs. And they need to be applauded. But the question should be, how should they be able to budget this amount of money so that at least they actually respond to drive climate action and address other environmental aspects as they do so, and provide tax incentives, tax breaks for enterprises, manufacturing. These climate action targeted aspects should actually be focused on this. A practical example we see across the continent is that if you are going to look at incentives, the Kenya Climate Bill 2001 had tax breaks for briquettes and for baggers. In Cameroon, in 2021, excess duty was removed from renewable energy importation of parts to assemble renewable and solar energy in the country. Across the continent, we are seeing what is called feed-in tariffs. If you are able to put these incentives in terms of money, you will notice that Africa is contributing a lot. But the question then becomes, are we really communicating this? Are we tapping into this? And that is quite very, very important because the discussion, as we speak today, means that this reimagination cannot just be mere words. They must actually be to respond, to ensure that budgeting cannot just become a cost center. It must move from a cost center to move into climate action that touches the lives of our mothers and brothers in communities. It must move into inspiring young people and having them have access to the finance to be well equipped to engage in profitable climate action entrepreneurship. It means leveraging the limited resources to develop what is called de-risking tools so we can tap into structures of cooperatives to be able to channel financing as opposed to individual actors, but through a communal approach. So we work in groups, in communities, in communal cooperatives to enhance market access, to enhance accessibility. And that takes me to the second to the last point, which is an aspect that goes beyond climate. If there is one thing that COVID taught us, if there is one lesson that we picked from COVID-19, it is that while emergencies may be on a global scale, they do not affect everyone equally. And therefore, we need what I call diversification. And diversification is the biggest security of any system in the world. And the reality that this COVID taught us is that it is our responsibility to be prepared regardless of where we are and regardless of what we do. What this taught us is that we cannot be able to focus only on maize, but we need to start thinking, why don't we leverage on our indigenous crops like cassava that has been proven not only to produce 300 products, but is a climate resilient crop that will grow during droughts and during floods. But I've not heard any debate on why cassava should be leveraged as an alternative to wheat. Because let's face it, with global wheat prices that increased by up to 50%, we saw African continent importing up to 85% of its wheat. A shift towards investing in alternatives has never been urgent as it is today. The changing climate is with us. Our maize and beans might not be able to do well anymore. We must be able to look at alternatives because the science is unequivocally clear that wheat production is projected to fall by up to 36% across the globe because of climate change, which would indicate more deficits, and alternatives like cassava will be least affected. Why is Africa not leveraging on her strength? That takes me to the last point. We must reimagine data. Data is king. Ignore it at your own peril. Africa stands out at having the least coverage of early warning. I said this at the beginning and I will say it is again now, which is needed to ensure that preparedness is enhanced. That preparedness against climatological risk like floods is enhanced. And while the urgency to address this gap is high, the continent stands an opportunity as we speak today to ensure that it covers this gap, not only to get data, but to get data that inform policy making, but also to get data on the viability of solutions. We talk about data to take action, but most of the time we do not communicate the data from the actions to ensure its optimization and its viability. And that has been the missing link in this debate, and that we must change. Because the reality is that without us understanding that early warnings are not just for climatological risks of drought and floods, they must also be about our nature. They must also be about pollution sources that are actually getting into our rivers and making the quality of the water unsuitable for drinking, resulting to what we call antimicrobial resistance. That you get sick today, you get sick tomorrow, and then you depend on antibiotics, and all of a sudden they become resistant. And that's the whole essence of our antimicrobial resistance, that environmental solutions must be able to be harnessed. And these environmental solutions are climate action solutions. When you turn waste to biofertilizer, that not only help to grow our food, but it helps us to move away from chemicalized fertilizers that are resulting to nitrous oxides that are contributing to emissions, but at the same time leaching to our rivers and destroying aquatic life and actually harming our health. This self-reinforcing cascading of solutions is what is needed today. If you consider Lake Victoria, Kenya's Lake Victoria, because of climate change induced risks of drought and floods and increasingly warmer weather, see fish stocks in Lake Victoria dropping by up to 25% as we speak today. And climate change causes warming of water, which calls algae blooming under these warming conditions of oxygen also depleted, causing fish suffocation. Measuring this is important, but also measuring the solutions that can actually be able to help, not only in ensuring that this doesn't happen, but also solutions to dry this fish like solar dryers. And bringing this data together is what will be able to help us. Amidst this reimagination of food systems, of our transport systems, of our energy system, reimagination of finance, of our data, there are aspects that if I miss to mention, then all this will be sweet music. And those aspects is to take the responsibility to each and every one of us. It is a responsibility because at the end of the day, all of these, regardless of what government will do, it is us, the citizens, regardless of where we are across the entire globe and across the entire African continent. If we don't play our part to meet government midway, we might not be able to take and move the needle forward. The changing climate is not an aspect that anybody is immune from. It therefore means that in the course of reimagining how we can close the policy gaps and governance gaps in the continent, we must cultivate purposeful passion. Passion is what I call the new currency of now. Passion is the fuel, it is the new currency of now. Give ideas to a passionate person, it turns those ideas into billions. But through money on someone who is not passionate, he squanders that money and nothing gets done. We must cultivate that passion at individual level, because that is what we need today. Passion is a currency. It cannot be bought with money, it cannot be bought with anything, but it is each and every one of us to start to become passionate about solutions, passionate about a narrative that informs, a narrative that inspires, a narrative that makes people to usher themselves to become solution providers. Another aspect that we need today is to train our minds. We like complaining. Serikali's idea. Hakuna mpesa, hakuna kazi. This is something that is common across the continent. Yes, it is not our fault. I grew up in the northwestern part of Cameroon, as I said. And one of the things that I learned, and our parents did this for us, not because they wanted to prevent us from not knowing, but it was just because of care. But it ended up not working well, that even when you have an idea and you sit in a house with elders, you cannot be able to express yourself. And that was done out of love. But it restricted us from having the confidence to be able to ideate, to be able to prefer solutions without being fear of any contradiction. And that made us to develop a mindset sometimes that even when you know you cannot speak, managing our mind, what I call training our mind, is important, because when we look across the world, the most innovative country in Africa is ranked 45th globally. That tells us something. There is something we're not doing right. We do not ideate. We do not prefer new ideas. And that is why we must appreciate this Earthwise Summit, the Kusi festivals. There are spaces for ideation. But the point I'm making here today is that the attitude of many of us is that we always ask, where has it worked? That you tell somebody that if you go to Turkana and see a solar dryer that has been fabricated by the local community, the first question is, where has it worked before it is working here? The attitude of questioning that, where has it worked? Why can't we make it work here so that others can pick it to other places for it to work? So the attitude of the question, where has it worked, must be able to be stopped. The only way to get ahead is to pioneer and prefer solutions and test solutions, and that's what innovation is all about. Innovations are not about new inventions. They're about bringing added value, novelty. And the changing climate ushers us to that space to bring added value, novelty, to learn from one another, to tap from our indigenous knowledge. And this is what we must start doing. And this takes us to the point which is important. We must have faith in ourselves and believe in what we do. Hope is not a strategy. It is not. Faith is a belief that I can do it and fail and learn. But you fell forward. And it is only by believing and doing it that hope can be generated. Hope in seeing that things are done, that we can inspire other people to usher themselves into the climate space. This is quite very, very important, because if we don't demonstrate faith by acting, using what we already have, rather than waiting to get what we don't have to act, that will never work. You can only get what you don't have by using what you have. And what you have is your skill. What you have is your ability to communicate solutions, to inspire others to usher themselves. Because each and every one of us seated here today hold a piece of the solution to the changing climate. We hold a piece of the solution to drive pollution action, to drive nature action. And all of us seated here today across the entire African continent must be able to leverage this new paradigm of reimagination, of reimagining solutions that will help our mothers to put food on the table, of understanding fully well that the prevailing climate emergencies leave us with fewer alternatives, and that if we continue talking and not acting, nothing will change, it will only get worse. And the prevailing emergencies are coming at a time which, in the 1940s and 1960s, we saw the clamor of independence across the continent, where our mothers, our brothers and sisters, our founding fathers ushered themselves to action, not waiting for elusive perfection, but saying we were to liberate the continent. But in 2023, ours is not about liberating the continent from independence or to gain independence. It's about building climate resilience for the African continent. It is about self-appointing ourselves as men and women to usher ourselves into action, understanding fully well that when spiders unite, they can tie down a lion. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Dr. Munang. And ladies and gentlemen, that was quite the insightful. One of the key things that we have, and one of the key things that we need to reimagine is our food system, our transport system, for more sustainability. And one of the things also that he happened to mention, even in our food system as a country, as much as climate change is affecting the African continent, with our continent even emitting less than 4% of greenhouse gases, our food security is what is at stake as an African country. And I was even telling my colleague Leon that it's time we shift from the foods that we normally eat, fast foods that we normally eat, to now sustainable foods. These are indigenous seeds, indigenous foods. I'm pretty sure some of you who are seated here, we spoke about the Gen Zs. When we talk to Gen Zs about some of these indigenous seeds and indigenous foods, they look at us as though we're saying something new. But it's time we have this conversation to also, even to the farmers on the ground, it's time we take these conversations from the boardroom to the ground to ensure even the farmers are aware of the seeds that they're planting in their farm for more sustainability. Seeds that can be able to withstand climate change. Foods that can be able to withstand even the increasing temperatures that we are experiencing as a continent.